welcome to Toronto Talks, the podcast that brings you the most important stories about money, business, and technology.
Whether you're an entrepreneur, a tech enthusiast, or just looking to stay ahead of the curve, we dive deep into the latest in finance, innovation, and industry.
Hosted by Ashraf Amin and Sophie the Sage,
we blend human expertise with cutting-edge technology to explore the dynamic world of modern industry
with fearless curiosity and wit.
Let's get started.
It was called Liberation Day, but if you were watching the markets, it looked like a lot more like Detonation Day. 10% tariffs across the board, 36 on China, 46 on Vietnam, 20% on the EU. And yes, even our good old polite maple syrup loving selves up here in Canada, we took a hit. The Nasdaq tanked. The Canadian dollar dropped faster than Trudeau's approval ratings. Global markets flinched like they'd just seen Trump tweet in all caps again.
Over $2 trillion in global market value was vaporized. Wall Street called it economic shock therapy. Ottawa called it deeply disappointing. And Canadian exporters? They just sighed, muttered something about softwood lumber and went back to work.
This isn't just another tariff tantrum. This is Trump 2.0 with a blueprint. Meaner, leaner, and a whole lot more scorched earth than last time. And guess what? Canada's right in the blast radius.
In this episode, we're diving headfirst into the tension between Canada and the United States. A relationship that's part best friends, part dysfunctional exes, and part business partners who forgot to read the fine print.
We're going to break down the tariffs, the rhetoric, and the real strategy behind the chaos. Because whether you love him or loathe him, Trump isn't just flipping over the trade table. He's building a new one with different rules.
We'll go back, way back. Pre-NAFTA, the Auto Pact, the endless trade tiffs over dairy, aluminum, and, yes, our sacred lumber. Every time we thought we were on solid ground, the goalposts moved.
Right? We'll unpack what this means for Canadian industry, the global economy, and why even our closest allies are starting to look like competitors in Trump's zero-sum world.
And while Canada scrambles to figure out if it's in the green bucket, the yellow bucket, or just getting kicked in the export bucket,
we'll explore how tariffs are now being used not just as economic weapons, but as tools to reset the global system, and how interest rates, national debt, and geopolitics all get pulled into the blast zone.
So whether you're sipping Tim Hortons or riding out inflation with a Costco-sized jar of peanut butter, strap in.
Because borders, tariffs, and tensions isn't just about trade. It's about power, policy, and the friction that comes when empires reset themselves.
Let's get into it.
So let's rewind the tape, not to 2018 or even 1994. Let's go way back. Pre-NAFTA, pre-USMCA, back when free trade wasn't a guiding principle. It was more like a fever dream wrapped in red tape and protected markets.
Back then, the U.S. Canada trade relationship wasn't some polished, frictionless operation. It was a chaotic mix of mutual dependence, constant flare-ups, and the occasional handshake that barely covered the bruises. We weren't partners. We were rival siblings sharing a room, arguing over who left the tariffs on the thermostat.
And then came the 1930s, the decade when everything fell apart. The global economy was in freefall after the 1929 crash, and the U.S. response? It turned inward.
Enter the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. It raised U.S. tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods to record levels. Why? Because lawmakers thought they could protect American jobs and industries by pricing out foreign competition.
It was a protectionist Hail Mary, and it backfired spectacularly.
Other countries, including Canada, retaliated almost immediately. Ottawa slapped higher tariffs on 16 US products within weeks, everything from farm equipment to textiles. They also signed a trade agreement with Britain to reduce reliance on the American market.
And just like that, global trade became a full-on tit-for-tat war. US exports dropped by over 60%. Canada's economy, deeply tied to natural resources and US demand, shrank fast.
It didn't just deepen the depression, it poisoned the idea of open trade for a generation. The US and Canada spent the next 30 years dancing around each other, trading out of necessity, but always with one eye on the
You know what it reminds me of? Ever had a roommate who keeps eating your food and then acts surprised when you lock the fridge?
Exactly. That was the dynamic. Mutual need mixed with chronic mistrust.
So, why didn't we diversify earlier? Like, at some point, didn't someone in Ottawa say, hey, maybe putting 75% of our eggs in America's basket is risky?
Oh, they did. There were all kinds of reports and commissions warning about overexposure. But the US market was just too big, too close, and too familiar. Plus, every time we tried to expand trade with Europe or Asia, we ran into bigger players with deeper pockets. It's like trying to date outside your type and realizing you have no game.
Right. So, we stuck with the devil we knew, basically.
Pretty much. And to be fair, the Auto Pact helped solidify that codependence. It wasn't just economic, it was strategic. It tied Canada directly into America's industrial base, especially for defense.
Which makes it even more ironic that they then turned around and labeled our steel a national security threat.
Exactly. That's like borrowing your neighbor's lawnmower for 50 years, then calling the cops when they ask for gas money.
Now, jump to the 1960s, North America's economies are booming and both countries finally see an opportunity to cooperate. That's when the Auto Pact is born in 1965.
The deal allowed US and Canadian auto manufacturers to produce cars across borders without tariffs, as long as production levels stayed roughly balanced.
The results were massive. By the early 70s, Canadian auto exports to the US quadrupled. Southern Ontario became Detroit's northern cousin, and we finally had something resembling a binational supply chain.
But it wasn't perfect. The Auto Pact only covered vehicles and parts. Everything else? Still fair game for tariffs and trade tantrums.
Which brings us into the 1970s and 80s, where things got messy again. Lumber, beef, wheat, wine, almost every major Canadian export faced some kind of US restriction or duty at one point.
We were stuck in a cycle. Economic integration was increasing, but the rules were still unstable. Canada depended on US access, and Washington never hesitated to weaponize it.
And let's not forget the domestic tension in Canada as well. Free trade was controversial, especially heading into the 1988 federal election.
That election was basically a referendum on the proposed Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, CUFTA. Brian Mulroney backed it hard. The Liberals and NDP opposed it, warning it would erode Canadian sovereignty.
Spoiler alert, Mulroney won. CUFTA was signed in 1989 and kicked off a new era. It slashed tariffs, opened investment channels, and locked in trade rules with legal mechanisms.
And let's not forget, it was the central issue in that 1988 election. People were legit protesting in the streets. Free trade wasn't some boring policy item. It was seen as either salvation or surrender.
Then came NAFTA. In 1994, Mexico joins the party and North America becomes one massive integrated trade zone.
For Canada, it was a game changer. 75% of our exports started heading to the US. Supply chains were now so interconnected that even minor trade disruptions triggered ripple effects across the entire continent.
Manufacturing, agriculture, energy, you name it. Canada was all in, and for a while it seemed like we'd finally figured out how to make the most of the relationship.
But even at its peak, it was fragile. US domestic politics kept threatening to rip it up. Every new administration brought new anxieties. We were integrated, but never immune.
And in 2016, that office changed hands, and with it, the tone shifted overnight.
Trump's rhetoric was clear from day one. NAFTA is the worst trade deal in the history of trade deals, maybe ever.
In 2018, he acted on it. NAFTA was torn up. We got USMCA, a renegotiated deal that kept the framework but added all kinds of new provisions.
And while the ink was still drying, Trump hit Canada with aluminum and steel tariffs under the guise of national security.
Which, to be clear, is like saying you locked your best friend out of the house because you thought they might turn into a burglar.
Exactly. Canada responded with retaliatory tariffs of its own on US steel, aluminum, and yes, even maple syrup and whiskey. It was diplomatic warfare, but with pancakes and bourbon.
The lesson? Even with USMCA in place, the relationship is still volatile. And when a US president decides to go full unilateral, Canada's position is precarious at best.
We're deeply integrated, yet fundamentally exposed. We trade like partners, but when politics heat up, we're treated like rivals.
So here we are again. Trump's back in office, tariffs are back on the table, and Liberation Day wasn't just a headline. It was a signal the old rules are gone. All right, so here we are in 2025, and Trump's second administration has launched what may be the oldest and bluntest trade policy in modern US history.
He called it Liberation Day, but for investors, it felt more like Economic Judgment Day, and Wall Street reacted accordingly. Stocks plummeted, volatility spiked, and economists across cable news hit DEFCON levels of hand-wringing.
And it wasn't just a symbolic move. This wasn't a light dusting of tariffs to prove a point. It was a full-on economic carpet bomb. We're talking 34% on China, 46% on Vietnam, and double-digit hits on the EU, South Korea, Australia, pretty much everyone except maybe the moon.
And even the moon might want to check its trade balance just to be safe. But the messaging, that's where things really start to get interesting. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent didn't just announce the tariffs, he framed them as justice, as payback, as populist redemption. His exact words, "This is Main Street's turn."
Let's pause on that, because that line isn't just optics, it's strategy. It flips the script. For decades, it's been Wall Street wins, globalism wins. Now the narrative is America rebuilds, workers get theirs.
This isn't some technocratic adjustment to policy margins. It's a sledgehammer, a total rewrite of the economic playbook, and it's being sold not just as necessary, but as moral, as patriotic, as inevitable.
The elites had their 20-year outsourcing party. Now the hangover's over, the lights are on, and the new plan? Bring back jobs, factories, and tax relief to the places that globalization gutted.
And they're doing it with the oldest tool in the kit, tariffs. Not as punishment, but as leverage, as fuel for a new kind of industrial revolution.
And if this all sounds radical, here's the twist. It is actually a throwback, because when Scott Bessent invoked Main Street, he wasn't just talking populism. He was reaching way back to Alexander Hamilton.
Exactly. The $10 founding father without a father, and a guy who believed America's strength started with factories, not finance. For Hamilton, tariffs weren't just taxes, they were strategy.
Hamilton saw tariffs as a way to protect fledgling American industries from being wiped out by cheap British goods. Build the factories, train the workers, grow the economy from within.
Fast forward 230 years and suddenly we're back to that playbook, but on steroids. Only now the infant industries are AI chip fabs, battery plants, and advanced robotics hubs in Ohio and Indiana.
So, do you think this historical framing is really landing with the public, Sophie? Or is it just a smart way to dress up economic nationalism?
A bit of both. The Hamilton reference isn't for Main Street, it's for the commentariat. But what is landing is the sense of revival, a broken system finally turning inward. The voters don't need to know Hamilton's policies to understand the gut-level appeal of build here, not there.
Right. It's less about citations and more about vibes.
Exactly. And politically, the vibes are strong. In swing states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, the message hits hard. We're bringing it all home. We're protecting you.
But let's not get swept up in the sentiment. What's the actual risk here? Is there a downside to putting the founding fathers in hard hats?
Well, if the revival narrative overshoots reality, you end up with overpromises and underdelivered factories. Industrial policy is a slow burn, not a campaign cycle magic trick.
Still, in terms of narrative, this is nation building 2.0 with Trump in the Hamilton role and Main Street cast as the founding fathers of the new industrial age. And just when you think this is all about money and manufacturing, it shifts. Because the Trump administration isn't framing this as just an economic pivot. They're calling it a national security imperative.
Right. And here's the logic in plain English. If your enemies make your medicine, your cars, and your chips, you've got a problem. Tariffs aren't just about trade. They're about survival.
Sure, every president since Obama has mentioned supply chain resilience. But Trump, he's turned it into a central doctrine. Less policy memo, more rally cry.
Right. In his words, this is about breaking dependency and restoring leverage. It's an offensive strategy, not a defensive one. He's not reacting to threats. He's preemptively redrawing the battlefield.
And it's not just targeted at China. Canada's being swept up in it too. Despite being a reliable trading partner for decades now, we're being reclassified as a liability.
It's not about relationships anymore. It's about position. You're either inside the economic fortress or outside the gates. Even long-standing allies are being reassessed,
considering
not by
how
trust, but by function.
Closely integrated our economies have been since NAFTA. We've co-manufactured everything from cars to ketchup.
Irony's not a recognized category in trade law. The US is redrawing the map, deciding which countries are trusted and which get hit with a tariff and a press release.
And this isn't just press conference bluster. The National Economic Council has redefined trade dependency as a national vulnerability. That's a major bureaucratic shift with real teeth.
Exactly. What used to be a matter of efficiency is now a matter of sovereignty. And for Canada, that means everything we thought was predictable is suddenly negotiable.
All right, let's follow the money, because beyond the headlines and the rhetoric, this strategy is building something else entirely. A massive, unspoken revenue machine, right?
That's not just a revenue stream, it's a political jackpot, a way to fund bold promises without touching income tax or corporate tax. Just slap a tariff on imports and boom, new budget line.
So what's the plan? Use it to fund middle-class tax relief, infrastructure projects, maybe even cut payroll taxes?
All of the above. The pitch is simple. Tax imports to fund domestic revival. Cut taxes on work, raise taxes on stuff, especially stuff made by countries that aren't playing fair.
Which sounds good, unless you're buying the stuff, because tariffs raise prices. And the middle class, that tax relief, it might get swallowed up whole by inflation at the checkout line.
And that's the risk. The economics are messy, but the politics, they're tight. Trump gets to say, I cut your taxes and made China pay for it.
It's a slogan and a stimulus rolled into one. But is there any real concern that this becomes too addictive? Like, Once you've got a $500 billion piggy bank coming in from tariffs, when do you shut that off?
You're spot on. Tariffs are no longer just leverage. They're a revenue stream. Once they start funding campaign promises, good luck reversing course. It becomes baked into the budget.
And if voters start seeing tariffs as the thing that funds their tax cuts, you're never turning that spigot off. It becomes political fentanyl, cheap, fast, and wildly popular.
Tariffs used to be a pressure tactic. Now they're infrastructure funding with a nationalist halo, a new kind of sugar high with red, white, and blue packaging.
But zoom out even further, and the picture starts to shift again. This isn't just tariffs or taxes. It's starting to look like an engineered economic reset.
Even billionaire hedge fund whisperer Ray Dalio has a name for this kind of play. He calls it the reset lever. Slow things down, trigger the Fed, and rebuild from the wreckage. Cut reliance on foreign capital, bring supply chains home, and buy your country room to breathe.
But is that by design, or just an accidental side effect of Trump's scorched earth style?
Depends who you ask. But for those watching closely, pressure, collapse, cut, reset, rebuild. It's macroeconomic judo.
So tariffs become not just tools for trade, but a lever to bend monetary policy.
Exactly. It's bold, risky, and absolutely deliberate. And if it works, Trump gets to say he reset the American economy and redefined the global system along the way.
It's the kind of strategy that looks insane in real time until you see it in hindsight, and it starts to resemble genius. Or at least very expensive improvisation.
And all of it rides on timing. If the economy buckles too fast, the whole plan collapses. But if it holds just long enough to force the Fed's hand, game changer.
Alright, so we've covered the tariffs, the messaging, and the macroeconomic strategy, but what about the machine that's actually executing this playbook? Enter DOGE, the Office of Government Efficiency.
If that sounds like a Silicon Valley startup, it's because it kind of is. DOGE was created to do what most government agencies wouldn't dare, cut themselves. Not trim, not reform. Cut. Entire departments, entire programs, entire workflows. Gone. It's like Marie Kondo got handed the federal budget and a chainsaw.
And it's not just symbolism. In the first 60 days, DOGE reportedly flagged over 300 federal programs for review, suspension, or outright elimination. From bloated grant schemes to regulatory bottlenecks, anything that couldn't be directly tied to national productivity, they marked as expendable. And they did it fast, like hacker speed fast.
One of their internal memos actually read, "We're not here to manage decline, we're here to bulldoze dysfunction," which sounds dramatic until you realize how many agencies were basically running on cruise control from the 80s. Paper forms, fax machines, inter-office mail like it's 1991.
Here's what's wild though. This isn't just about shrinking government. It's about freeing up labor. According to Besant, every dollar saved through DOGE cuts is a dollar that can be redirected towards reindustrialization. The idea is less bureaucracy, more boots on the factory floor. It's not austerity, it's reallocation.
The logic is, you're not cutting for the sake of cutting. You're clearing space, simplifying compliance, shortening the distance between capital and action. In theory, that's supposed to help small businesses, manufacturers, and regional employers spend less time on paperwork and more time on payroll. Especially in the Rust Belt towns, they're targeting for revival.
But critics say it's just chaos in a suit. That this efficiency doctrine is really just slash and burn governance, dressed up in PowerPoint slides and buzzwords.
Maybe. But the impact is real. Government contractors are panicking, lobbyists are losing ground, and even career bureaucrats are reportedly asking, wait, do we actually do anything here? Some are even leaving before they find out the answer.
And that's the question. That existential bureaucratic question is exactly what DOGE was designed to provoke. Because in Trump's second term, inefficiency isn't just bad policy, it's the enemy. And DOGE, it's the wrecking crew.
And it's clearing the path for what comes next, because all this deregulation, all this cutting, it's more than about shrinking government. It's about resetting the conditions for how America builds, spends, and earns. That's where the tariffs come back into play.
Exactly. Let's zoom out. The Trump administration isn't just throwing tariffs around for drama. They're trying to turn them into foundational pillars, a new kind of fiscal bridge between Main Street and the federal balance sheet.
Think of it like this. Tariffs used to be a lever for punishing bad actors. Now they're a funding stream. Trump hits foreign imports with tariffs. And instead of just using that as leverage in a trade deal, he pockets the revenue and channels it back into the domestic economy.
And that changes everything. We're talking about $300 to $600 billion per year in projected revenue. That's not a headline, that's a second tax base. One that doesn't touch your paycheck, doesn't touch your investment income, and doesn't require Congress to hike anything.
It's politically brilliant because you can cut income taxes, float middle-class relief, juice infrastructure, and say you paid for it by taxing Beijing. You become the blue-collar Robin Hood with a MAGA hat.
But here's the kicker. It doesn't stop at revenue. The Trump team is pitching this as a way to realign the entire fiscal framework, shift the tax burden from work to consumption, reward production, and discourage outsourcing. And do it all without touching entitlement programs or blowing up the debt ceiling.
That last part is key, because the real subtext here, and this is where it gets spicy, is about debt.
Right. The U.S. is sitting on $34 trillion in national debt, and the Trump camp knows that if they can slow the economy just enough with tariffs, they might be able to nudge the Fed into cutting rates.
Lower rates mean cheaper debt. Cheaper debt means refinancing. And refinancing means you get to push your fiscal problems downfield while looking like you're solving them.
Exactly. It's fiscal judo. Hurt the economy in one place just enough to ease the pressure in another. Then use the breathing room to rebuild.
Ray Dalio actually called this the reset lever. Trigger short-term pain to restructure long-term obligations. If you pull it off, you reset not just your supply chains, but your monetary position. You buy time, power, and leverage.
But that all hinges on control. And tariffs for this administration are all about control of trade, of revenue, of the narrative, and most importantly, of time.
Time to reshape the labor market. Time to realign policy with production. And time to sell the American voter a new story. One where tariffs don't just hurt your enemy, they fund your future.
And Canada? We're not just watching this happen. We're getting dragged into the current. And the real question is, are we swimming with the tide or just trying to keep our head above water here?
Well, if we're trying to keep our head above water, the Americans just turned on the wave machine. Because this isn't just about tariffs or deregulation or even DOGE. It's about stacking the incentives. The Trump administration isn't just hammering one policy lever, they're pulling all of them at once. Think of it like a national flywheel. Tariffs generate revenue, deregulation slashes red tape, energy stays cheap, and taxes stay low. And it all spins in a single direction, back toward American production. And if you think that sounds chaotic, that's sort of the point.
It's like controlled demolition. You don't just knock down a skyscraper by politely removing the drywall. You wire it for collapse, hit the button, and hope it falls in the right direction. And Trump's economic team, they've wired the system with precision.
Take deregulation. The administration's not just trimming fat, they're hacking through structural limbs. Whole compliance departments across agencies are being gutted. Review times are collapsing from years to weeks. And the playbook's simple. If a regulation slows production, it dies. Doesn't matter if it's environmental, procedural, or tied up in equity language, DOGE doesn't discriminate.
Same thing with energy. They're making it cheap, fast, and local. Everything from domestic LNG terminals to small modular nuclear reactors is suddenly national interest infrastructure. You can practically see the red tape being shredded in real time.
And taxes? Predictable and low. The administration isn't promising a full-blown tax revolution yet, but the pitch is clear. Build here, and we'll reward you. The idea is to create a climate where American manufacturers know what to expect, quarter to quarter, year to year.
That predictability matters, especially in a world where central banks shift tone on a dime and global supply chains still haven't fully recovered from COVID.
But here's the interesting twist. It's not just about enticing American firms. It's about signaling to global companies that the US is the new China. Not politically, obviously, but in terms of cost, speed, and reliability.
Right. You want stability, you want scale, and you want policy alignment? Come to America. That's the message.
And a big part of that is narrative. Trump's team is relentlessly on message. Besant, Navarro, the economic crew, they're singing the same tune in every speech. Wall Street had its run, now it's Main Street's turn.
And when they say Main Street, they don't mean brunch spots and candle boutiques. They mean grit, foundries, factory floors, CNC machines, and Rust Belt revival zones.
They're painting a picture of a reborn America, where AI-enhanced factories hum along the Ohio River, where 3D printed parts replace overseas imports, and where American workers finally feel like stakeholders again.
It's a compelling vision, and it's one Canada can't ignore, but while we're still debating green tax credits and carbon pricing, the US is offering the world something different. Speed, scale, and a front row seat in a new industrial age.
And like it or not, if we want to stay in the game, we're going to have to start playing with different rules.
So let me ask you, Sophie, with all these pieces in motion, DOGE, deregulation, energy, and economic nationalism, what exactly is Canada's next move? Are we stepping up or just watching the playbook change from the sidelines?
If we're watching from the sidelines, Ash, we might want to start stretching. Because this isn't a game that lets you warm up mid-play. The US isn't just rewriting the economic playbook, they're daring the rest of the world to keep up. And the final piece of their strategy? Using tariffs not just as weapons, but as bridges. To tax reform, to debt realignment, to workforce restructuring. It's like watching someone use a grenade launcher as a multi-tool.
Right? And it's kind of brilliant. You know, assuming it doesn't blow up in their faces. Because here's the big macro shift. Tariffs used to be a negotiating chip. Now they're being framed as a structural fix, a shortcut to reset America's economic posture. You tax foreign goods and reduce the need for income tax hikes. And if you're really ambitious, you reroute that revenue into domestic incentives.
And not just any incentives, we're talking payroll tax cuts, small business tax relief, targeted child tax credits, every populist lever you can pull with a red, white and blue bow on top. Tariffs fund the optics. The optics fund the campaign.
And at scale, it's real money. The administration's own estimates suggest $300 to $600 billion per year in tariff revenue. Enough to offset a significant chunk of federal income, if redistributed.
And if they succeed in sparking a manufacturing boom, reshored jobs, revitalized cities, autonomous hardware plants in places like Pittsburgh and Toledo, then the domestic tax base grows. Long-term revenue from real economic activity, not just imports.
In other words, tariffs don't just fund the now, they fund the future. And they provide the cover to clean up a broken tax code without pitching a tent in the deficit.
Which makes this not just a trade policy, but a macroeconomic reset button. One that links debt, interest rates, labor, and global positioning into a single audacious gamble.
And if that reset takes hold, we're not just dealing with a more protectionist America. We're dealing with a more independent, more inward-facing, and more unapologetically assertive one.
The kind of America that doesn't just disrupt global norms, it dares its allies to adapt or be left behind.
So that brings us back to Canada. Because While Washington rewires its economy with tariffs, deregulation, and DOGE, what exactly is Ottawa doing? What's our plan? Are we hedging? Are we leveraging? Are we just issuing polite press releases and hoping for the best?
Coming up, we zoom in on Canada's response. The April 3rd countermeasures, the currency slide, and why being disappointed isn't going to cut it when your largest trading partner just went full renegade.
This episode of Toronto Talks is brought to you by Conquest Distributors, your trusted source for shipping, packaging, and warehouse supplies. For nearly 20 years, they've helped Canadian businesses thrive with fast, reliable service and a commitment to integrity and efficiency. Getting the products you need when you need them has never been easier. Now, let's talk about something real. With the latest round of tariffs coming from south of the border, supporting Canadian manufacturers and supply vendors isn't just good for business, it's good for Canada. So why keep funneling money to U.S. giants like Uline when you can get the same or better quality products right here at home? When you choose Conquest Distributors, you're not just getting top-tier packaging, shipping, and warehouse essentials at competitive prices. You're investing in local businesses, strengthening Canadian supply chains, and keeping economic power here at home where it belongs. With fast, reliable fulfillment, an easy-to-use online store, and a team that genuinely cares about your success, Conquest Distributors proves that Canadian businesses can compete and win on quality and service. And now, to make it even easier, Toronto Talks listeners get to enjoy 15% off their first online order with promo code TALK15. Head on over to conquestdistributors.ca and see for yourself. That's conquestdistributors.ca, your trusted business supply partners. Now, back to the show.
So here's the million-loonie question. Is Canada still a trusted ally or just convenient collateral?
Yeah, because if you look at how things have unfolded since Liberation Day, it's hard not to feel like we've been swept up in something we didn't sign up for. Tariffs didn't just hit Beijing or Berlin. They hit Barrie and Burnaby too.
Right. It's more than a trade war. It's a trust recalibration. The US isn't operating on legacy relationships anymore. They're working off a new map. Strategic interests first, traditional allies second.
And if we're being honest, that stings. Because Canada has done what it was supposed to do. We signed on to NAFTA, then USMCA. We aligned our energy policies, our defense systems, our supply chains. We even tolerated getting called a national security threat over aluminum.
And now we're lumped in with the same tariff buckets as geopolitical rivals. Scott Bessent, the new Treasury Secretary, didn't mince words in April. He said, and I quote, "The US government will no longer prioritize lobbying pressure from foreign allies. If your companies want access, they'll need to build here."
Translation? We don't care how friendly you are. If you're not creating jobs on US soil, expect friction. It's not personal, it's transactional. And that's a shift we're still trying to get caught up with.
The markets caught up quickly. After Liberation Day, the Canadian dollar dropped nearly 3% against the US dollar. That's not just economic noise. That's a flashing neon sign that says, exposed.
Absolutely. And let's be clear, this isn't some dramatic overreaction. It's a sober recalculation of risk. If Washington can slap tariffs in Canada with barely a shrug, what else might they do?
Especially when the message from the top is America first again, but this time with actual follow-through.
So what exactly was Canada's official response? Press conferences, countermeasures, and a whole lot of deep disappointment, and more importantly, does any of it actually matter?
So here's what happened next. Trudeau stood at the podium, flanked by ministers, staring down a press pool, and delivered what's now becoming Canada's default foreign policy stance, measured disappointment.
Which, let's be honest, might work if this were still a game of diplomacy, but it's not. It's economic trench warfare. And in warfare, measured disappointment isn't going to stop incoming fire.
Exactly. On April 3rd, Ottawa rolled out a set of modest countermeasures, narrow tariff adjustments, a vague pledge to diversify markets, and a few sternly worded talking points about the importance of partnership and shared prosperity.
Meanwhile, the US was playing poker with a bazooka on the table. And Canada, we were still checking the rulebook to see if, bazookas were allowed.
The disparity was glaring. While the US Treasury and National Economic Council were coordinating with AI modelling firms and industry lobbyists to remap global trade flows, Canada's Department of Global Affairs was putting together stakeholder roundtables and listening sessions.
It's like bringing a debate team to a demolition derby.
And the thing is, this isn't new. Canada's response has followed the same pattern for decades. Shock, followed by consultation, followed by soft retaliation, and then a quiet hope that cooler heads will prevail.
But what if they don't? What if this isn't a heat-of-the-moment overreaction, but a durable, deliberate policy shift? That's part of what we're not grappling with here.
Bessent was crystal clear. The US is done negotiating with diplomats. They want deals from CEOs, shovels in the ground, factories on US soil.
And here's the kicker. Canadian companies are actually listening. After Liberation Day, several top exporters began quietly exploring US expansion plans. Not because they want to, but because they have to.
Because disappointment might soothe the public, but it won't save your margins.
Exactly. We can issue all the statements we want, but if our strategy doesn't evolve, our industries won't survive. And hoping for a reversion to the old playbook, that's not strategy, that's nostalgia.
So what does Canada actually do here? Do we treat this as a wake-up call to diversify, or do we just white-knuckle it and try to ride this thing out?
And that's the million-dollar question. Because the idea of diversification sounds great. Until you remember we've been talking about it for 30 years and still send 75% of our exports to the US.
Exactly. We love the idea of trade diversification until it means dealing with unfamiliar rules, less favourable logistics, and competitors who eat subsidy programs for breakfast.
And meanwhile, Trump's tariffs have made one thing painfully clear. US market access is no longer guaranteed. It's conditional. You want to sell in America? You better be building there too.
Which is why Canadian firms are now caught in a bind. On one side, they're facing punitive tariffs. On the other, they're being quietly courted to set up shop stateside, with incentives, predictable policy, and lower energy costs.
And that's the real strategy here, right? It's more than about punishment, it's about attraction. Carrot and stick, or maybe hammer and carrot.
We're already seeing it happen. Companies in automotive, agri-tech, and clean energy are quietly forming US subsidiaries, lobbying for trusted supplier status and lining up for DOGE's deregulated fast lane.
So how does the Canadian government respond? Do we incentivize companies to stay and weather the storm, or do we help them leave and try benefiting from dual operations? It really leaves us in a precarious position, to say the least.
And here's the kicker. Some of our closest allies are doing just that. Germany, Japan, even the UK are negotiating carve-outs and deals directly with Washington. They're not waiting to get lumped in with Loto and Brazil.
Canada's instinct has always been, don't rock the boat. But what if the boat is already sinking? Maybe it's time we build a new one, on our own terms.
Or at the very least, stop pretending we're still the co-captain.
Right, because maybe it's not just about how we respond, but whether we even understand the game being played.
But here's the twist in all of this. While it sounds like chaos, there's a coherent strategy buried in the shockwaves. It's more than about tariffs or efficiency or even Main Street. It's about rewiring America's economic engine to run on a different fuel entirely, and doing it while the world's still trying to figure out what just hit them.
Exactly. The Trump administration isn't just leveraging tariffs for political effect. They're using them as a bridge toward a completely different kind of economic foundation. One that replaces decades of debt-fueled globalization with domestic production, simplified taxation, and a reshuffled workforce.
Think of it like this. If the old model was offshore to grow, borrow to spend, the new model is reshore to compete, simplify to survive. And that's where things get especially interesting, Because tariffs aren't just revenue generators, they're negotiating chips in a larger structural reset.
Scott Bessent had hinted at this publicly. Tariffs are the lever to force tax reform. Because if you're bringing hundreds of billions of dollars in trade duties, you've suddenly got room to lower payroll taxes or even shrink income tax brackets. And that's political gold.
And it's not just about cutting taxes, it's about realigning incentives. You tax consumption instead of labor. You make working families feel the benefit in every paycheck while shifting the pain of adjustment to foreign producers and multinationals who've been riding the wave of global arbitrage.
So you reroute the money, you deregulate the red tape, and you build your factories with AI and robotics instead of overseas labor. You sell it as a patriotic revival, and if it works, you reshape the middle class. If it doesn't, you've still changed the terrain so dramatically that no one can go back.
It's macroeconomic judo at nation-state scale. But here's the thing. Even if you don't agree with the ideology, you've got to respect the playbook. Because it's not improvised, it's coordinated, and it's being tested in real time.
And Canada, we can't just shrug this off. Because whether we like it or not, we're part of the supply chain being rerouted. The debt system being reevaluated, the alliance being redefined.
We used to be the polite neighbor, the reliable trade partner, the country that showed up on time, didn't make a fuss, and never missed a payment. But in this new era, reliability doesn't earn you goodwill, it earns you a tariff.
And the messaging couldn't be clearer. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said, "We're done letting foreign governments dictate U.S. domestic outcomes. That includes our friends." That's not just a policy shift, that's a red line, a warning shot.
Translation? Canada might not be the villain in this story, but we're not a protected character either. In the new framework, you're either bringing value back home to America, or you're part of the problem. Reshore or pay. Adapt or get priced out.
And Ottawa's response? Weak. Trudeau's press office called the tariffs deeply disappointing, which in Canadian political speak is one step above shrugging and offering you a donut. There's no counterstrike, no new strategy, just diplomatic posturing and a hope that things cool down.
But markets didn't wait. The loonie slipped. Exporters panicked. Boardrooms lit up with emergency calls. And from softwood lumber to EV batteries, every industry is asking the same question. Are we about to be priced out of our own backyard?
Because this isn't just about Canada losing access. It's about the US reshuffling the entire trade deck. If you're not bringing jobs, plants, or strategic material to the American mainland, your relationship is negotiable. And that includes us.
Which is why proximity, for the first time in modern history, is starting to feel less like an advantage and more like a liability.
And if Canada's not the one holding the pen, someone else is writing the rules for us. Because we've been bracing for a tariff war, but Washington's been laying the groundwork for something far more strategic and far less predictable.
Behind closed doors, something's brewing, and it's bigger than tariffs. They're calling it the Mar-a-Lago Accords. Not official yet, but the framework is taking shape. Quiet phone calls, off-record meetings, one-off concessions, a new global trade realignment built not in Geneva or Davos, but poolside in Florida.
And the pitch is pure trunk. You want to avoid the full tariff menu? Fine. Make a deal. Scrap your Airbus order. Buy U.S. energy. Open up your markets. Cancel that Chinese contract. And suddenly, your country gets moved from strategic liability to preferred partner.
This isn't Bretton Woods 2.0. It's something else entirely. No G7, no WTO consensus. This is bilateral diplomacy on steroids. One-on-one economic arm twisting designed to reshape the global playing field in America's image. And fast.
And here's what's wild. It's actually working. Countries are calling Washington with their own negotiation wish lists. What do we need to give up? What does the US want in return? Deals are being pitched like trade show promotions. 3 concessions and you get a waiver.
If even 30 of the 75 tariff-hit countries make meaningful concessions, it's a massive win, a new order, a commercial loyalty program with geopolitical consequences. And if you're not playing, you're paying.
In Canada, we're watching all this happen in real time, but we're not at the table. We're still submitting policy memos and press releases while other countries are brokering their futures on speakerphone.
Because in this new model, process doesn't matter, access does, visibility matters, leverage matters, and Canada's stuck playing by yesterday's rules while the US is rewriting them on a napkin.
So the question isn't whether the Mar-a-Lago Accords are real. It's whether we're ready for a world where that's how trade is done. No UN vote, no international forum, just a phone call, a concession, and a smile for the cameras.
Canada's playing chess while Washington's flipping the board and dealing poker. And Ottawa? Still politely adjusting its tie, hoping no one notices we brought a policy brief to a knife fight.
Let's talk about that, because while the US is throwing elbows and redrawing supply chains on the fly, Canada's response has been measured, diplomatic, bureaucratically elegant, and strategically soft.
The official response to Liberation Day? Deeply disappointing. That's not strategy, that's a shrug in a suit. When you're getting kneecapped by your biggest trading partner, disappointment isn't a policy, it's an obituary in slow motion.
Exactly. On April 3rd, Trudeau announced a set of countermeasures. Modest retaliatory tariffs, a few regulatory tweaks, and a commitment to ongoing dialogue. But here's the thing, dialogue doesn't move markets. Leverage does.
And while Trudeau's team was drafting statements, the Canadian dollar was in freefall. Investors saw what Ottawa didn't. There's no safe lane in a highway reroute. We're not just collateral damage, we're in the blast pattern.
And the truth is, this isn't the first time we've been caught flat-footed. From softwood lumber to aluminum, Canada spent decades reacting to US trade pressure instead of preempting it. We fight with spreadsheets while Washington shows up with sledgehammers.
And here's the cost: confidence. If international investors start seeing Canada as economically reactive instead of proactive, second tier instead of strategic, they'll start treating us that way. Higher risk premiums, lower capital flows, lost opportunity.
So what now? More dialogue? Another task force? Or do we finally admit that the old playbook doesn't work in this kind of game?
Because when the rules change, so does the definition of leadership. And right now, it's looking a lot like Canada's strategy is hoping someone else will blink first.
Let's be brutally honest here. Canada doesn't just need a strategy. It needs a shift in mindset. Because we're not dealing with trade as usual. We're dealing with an entirely new global game. And right now, we're acting like the rules still favor decorum.
And they don't. Not anymore. The Trump administration has made it crystal clear alliances are transactional. Trade is leverage. And you're either useful to the machine or you're standing in the way of it.
Absolutely. That's why you're starting to hear those whispers about something bigger than tariffs. Something more permanent, like the so-called Mar-a-Lago Accords. That kind of reset, one-on-one bilateral deals where each country gets their chance to cut a deal or get left behind.
Think of it as Bretton Woods flipped on its head, not a collective vision for global cooperation, but a series of hard-nosed trades for influence, access, and survival. It's poker night at the end of globalization, and every country's holding their cards close.
And Canada? We've spent decades betting on multilateralism, but if the new paradigm is bilateral, bespoke, and built on leverage, we've got to stop relying on legacy goodwill and start offering actual value, strategically, economically, and politically.
Because here's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. If Canada doesn't start showing its worth in hard terms, rare earths, AI infrastructure, defense manufacturing, energy independence, we're going to get friend-zoned by the very markets we depend on.
It's not about pleasing America, it's about positioning Canada, being indispensable, being innovative, and being fast.
Or else, we're not at the table negotiating a new economic order, we're on the menu.
So here's the trillion-dollar question. Are we witnessing the early stages of a necessary global economic reset? Or is this just good old-fashioned American overreach, turbocharged by nationalism, high on short-term optics? Because let's be real, this isn't just about tariffs anymore. This is about rewriting the post-World War II economic order in real time. One executive order at a time, one foreign leader phone call at a time. And for the first time in decades, it's being driven not by multilateral consensus, but by unilateral coercion backed by algorithms, capital flows, and a renewed belief in American exceptionalism.
And here's the kicker. It's working. At least tactically. In just a matter of weeks, countries that would have laughed off Trump's demands 5 years ago are now quietly lining up in Washington, not to file complaints, to cut deals, quietly, desperately, strategically. And not because they suddenly believe in the vision, but because they can't afford not to play the game.
Right. It's a patchwork of ad hoc trade resets, not negotiated in Geneva or ratified by global institutions, but rather brokered in private rooms through leverage, pressure, and fear of exclusion.
This isn't diplomacy, it's a digital age power play, a reordering not of ideals but of incentives, one where access is transactional, influence is rented, and loyalty is repaid only in relevance.
And here's the uncomfortable truth. It's not slowing down. The rest of the world is adapting, recalibrating, trying to stay in the game. The question for Canada, and for every country not holding the pen, is whether we're shaping the next chapter or just footnoted in it.
Because this isn't a phase, it's a pivot point. And the countries that cling to the old rules are going to find themselves playing checkers on a chessboard that's already halfway reset.
So, where does it all go from here? That depends on who's ready to let go of outdated assumptions and respond to the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. Power is shifting, the rules are changing, and those who hesitate, hoping things return to normal, are already falling behind. This moment calls for more than a reaction. It calls for intention. Because leadership now means knowing when to pivot, how to act, and having the nerve to do it first.
Because ready or not, the new world order isn't waiting for permission. It's already being written.
Alright, listeners, if you've been following along, you know what time it is. The Toronto Talks weekly BTC Scavenger Hunt is back. Every week, we hide a QR code somewhere in the city, and the first sharp mind to track it down and scan it wins real Bitcoin. No strings, no gimmicks, just sats for smarts. This week's prize is 50,000 sats. That's right, 50,000 satoshis for one lucky winner.
This scavenger hunt isn't just a game. It's a way to interact with your city, learn about Bitcoin, and connect with the Toronto Talks community. It's our way of saying curiosity pays. Literally. And remember, this is in addition to our regular Bitcoin rewards for thought-provoking questions and community contributions. Think of it as a bonus round for those who think boldly and act quickly.
Alright, here's your first riddle for this week's drop. Listen close. Where caffeine flows and creatives meet, the common hides a crypto treat. A board of notes, a wall of talk. Scan the code and start your walk.
Here's a second clue, just to nudge you in the right direction. On College Street, where stories brew, ideas are posted old and new. Find the space that locals trust and claim your satoshis before they're dust.
If you've cracked the code, don't wait. Look for a community board in one of the city's coziest creative corners. The QR code is hiding in plain sight, and the first person to scan it wins the 50,000 sats. Even if you're not first, snap a photo, share your adventure using the hashtag TorontoTalksBTC, and join the fun.
For full participation details, prize eligibility, and more ways to get involved, just head to our website, torontotalks.ca.
Alright, Toronto, stay sharp, stay adventurous, and stay plugged in. Whether it's Bitcoin or trade wars, one thing's for sure. Nobody's waiting around for permission anymore.
And in a world being rewritten by leverage, speed, and digital power, curiosity isn't just a virtue, it's your edge.
So that's it for the show. Like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and reach out to us anytime at talk@torontotalks.ca. We'll see you next time right here on Toronto Talks, where big ideas come to life.
And curiosity never sleeps.